Let's begin with the study of chemistry. I've already told you how important chemistry is to everything else we're doing. Chemistry is the study of matter, of stuff, of the substance and substances that make up our world, that make up your human body, that make up this room, that make up the earth, that make up the planets, that make up the stars. All of the substances that we know of in the universe are the subject of the study of chemistry. Right? And as I said, these are things for the entire, this is the entire universe as we know it. Now there may be some things out there we don't know. When chemists over the centuries have studied and studied the stuff that make us up, they have come to the realization that everything in existence is made up of a finite number of substances that they call elements. Okay? So the element is the name for a substance that is foundational. If you take everything apart, if you take all the substances and all the materials that there are in our world, and you take them all apart to the bottommost common denominator, when you do that, then you come up with these substances that we call elements. Over the years, as they have discovered more and more of these, they realize that many of these substances have properties in common. The substances each have a different weight. And basically you can categorize, you can put them all in a row and they just get heavier and heavier and heavier. And that's really one of the things that makes each one of the elements very, very different. But as they found ones that were alike, they began to put them into groups. And slowly but surely, a table of the elements was sort of realized or discovered. And basically when you look at this, all of the elements that are above or below each other in a line are in the same group. They all have similar properties. So when you study chemistry, you learn that. You learn that these are all alike, these are all alike. Each one of these vertical columns has substances that are very much alike. But if you want to read them from the lightest to the heaviest, you go across like this. And so you can imagine people at first had just a few of these pieces. They didn't have a table at the beginning. They just had some of these. But then as they started to put them in sort of an order, they began to see, oh, these seem to be falling in a nice, neat pattern here. So imagine this table with maybe 3/4 of these missing. But just enough there to go, hey, there seems to be some sort of order here. And then maybe if you had this one and this one, but you didn't have this one, you'd go, you know, there seems to be a gap here. Let's go looking for this one. And so slowly but surely, they have figured out all of the various elements of existence. These are the things that you and I are made out of. Our human bodies are made out of these things. You're familiar with some of these. Most of these are hidden deep within other substances. You're familiar with some of these like gold or silver, copper. Most of the metals that we know of, there are some alloys, bronze, and some other things that are not elements, but many, many of the metals that you and I would know of are elemental. When you have an element, you have something that just is. You've probably heard of alchemists, hundreds of years ago trying to make gold. The early chemists would try to take substances and put them together to make gold. Because if they could, they'd become very rich. So they tried and tried and tried. What they didn't know was that gold was an element. You can't make it. You can't put any two things together to make it. It's one of those elemental substances in the universe. These materials simply exist. These are the things that are, that are the foundation for everything else. This periodic table shows those. These are the things that just simply exist. There are 92 of these elements that exist in our natural world. Now, if you look at that periodic table, you'll see many more than 92 elements. They've run the numbers up into the hundreds. But you have to realize that all those ones above 92 are ones where some physicists got together. They took a big linear accelerator, either circular or long, and they slammed two elements together that were smaller. They fused together for a split second, and for one brief moment, this little glob of two elements exist as a single element, and then it flies back apart. It's just too unstable to exist in its form. But for one brief second it did, and these crazy physicists, they give it a name, they give it a number, and they say, there it is. And they did learn something about matter in general from doing that. The reaction that takes, the nuclear reaction that takes place and the particles that fly out of that have some meaning to physicists and people that are studying things that underlie chemistry itself. But in our regular everyday world, there are 92 naturally occurring. You can find these naturally in the earth. Now, the biggest ones, the heaviest one, like number 92, is uranium. Do you know what is unique about uranium? It's radioactive, right? It gives off radiation particles. And all of the ones up close to that, 92, 91, 90, they're all so big that they're unstable. And so what they're literally doing is throwing off little bits and pieces of themselves. And those elements there decay over time to lighter elements. But they do exist in nature, slowly decaying. So we can say that there's 92 building blocks then to our world, and 92 potential building blocks to our human bodies. The smallest piece of an element is something called an atom. You probably know the general picture of an atom, right? Right? That there's a nucleus with protons and neutrons. There are electrons circling that. Nobody has ever seen this. Okay? Nobody has ever seen a proton. Nobody has ever seen a neutron. Nobody has ever seen an electron. But believing that those things exist and testing for them every time we test, every time we do any sort of an experiment, the fact that these things exist as we see them here becomes true. Every time we do any sort of test, this is what the evidence points to, again and again and again. So many times there's been so much testing that we have an atomic theory that says this is really what's going on in the atom. And we don't have time to go into all of this, but we do want to establish that the atom then is the smallest piece. It's the smallest part of an element. If you just had one little object that was gold, it would be a gold atom. The one smallest piece of oxygen would be an oxygen atom. How many atoms, different kinds of atoms are there then? How many? 92, right? There's 92 elements. So there's just 92 different types of atoms. Now, if we've established now that there are these 92 building blocks, if I look around me and look at all the different variety of substances that I see in my world, I see a lot more than 92 substances, right? Aren't there more than 92 substances around us? So where do all of these other substances come from? If they're not elements, what are they? There's this vast number of substances, and all these other substances then are combinations of elements. If we reduced your human body to its simplest pieces, it would be a bunch of atoms. But the world has so much complexity to it because these elements then are the things that are put into combinations to create all the other substances in existence. A way to visualize this is to think about language. Think about letters and words. Do you know how many letters there are in the English alphabet? How many? 26, right? A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Now, if you go through the whole alphabet, 26 letters that we use to create words in English. How many words can you make from those 26 letters? An infinite number, right? You can make an infinite number of words out of those 26 letters. This is existence. There are a finite number of elements, but you can make jillions of different substances from those basic letters, right? An element, if you were doing it in language, might look like this, right? An element would be made up of all of the same atoms. If you can see some gold, you've got enough gold atoms collected in one place that you can actually see it. But if it's pure gold, then it is only gold atoms. Oxygen. Oxygen that we breathe looks like this. It's two oxygen atoms put together. That's pure oxygen, right? A compound, something that is a combination of elements, might look like a word like this, where you've got various letters in it, right? Here's a combination of elements, and you can see there's carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. C stands for carbon, H hydrogen, O oxygen. And these 24 atoms are put into a combination that creates what we call sugar. So, atoms and molecules. Molecule is the name that we use for like the words. If we're still staying with that idea of letters and words, letters would be the atoms and molecules would be the words. Molecules are atoms that have been joined to one another into a larger object. You've probably seen, or if you've taken a chemistry class, you certainly handled these balls and sticks, right? Did some exercises with this kind of a thing where each one of the balls here represents an atom, and each one of the sticks here represents what we call a chemical bond, a joining of the two. So it takes a special chemical combination, not just a mixture of things, but a special combination to create what we would call a molecule. Molecules can be small and simple like the ones you see here. They can be sort of a medium complexity. This is that sugar molecule that I had in the other. There's 24 atoms here that are combined. You can see there's sort of a ring structure here and then little things sticking off in different places. That's a sugar molecule. It's just 3 different types of atoms, but chemically bonded in a unique way to make something we would call a molecule. And then there are molecules that are hundreds of thousands of atoms. This is a representation of DNA. And this is just a small little piece of it. You can hardly count how many atoms there are just in this one little piece right there. So molecules can be very small and simple. They can be huge and complicated, especially in living things. The most complex molecules in existence are in living things. A good example of this idea of chemical bonding versus not chemical bonding would be just take the two substances, air and water. Okay? You know what air is? You're breathing air right now. You know what water is. Air is a mixture of elements. Okay? The hydrogen atoms here are bonded. The oxygen atoms here are stuck together, but this is pure oxygen, this is pure hydrogen, and the air that you and I breathe is just a mixture. Now, do you know the formula for water? What is it? H2O, which tells me that there are 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. It looks kind of like this. These are chemically bonded to one another. So what's the difference between this and this? Just bonding, right? Just the fact that these are connected and these are not. And just by connecting them, you get an entirely different substance, don't you? Right? Water seems so much different than the air, and yet it's the same stuff, isn't it? Here the atoms are bonded into molecules, and there they aren't. So it isn't the fact that you just have a bunch of atoms. The atoms are either not connected to one another or they are connected. And as soon as you connect them, you have a new object, you have a molecule. This is a water molecule. And you have hugely different properties. This becomes something other than just hydrogen and oxygen. It is a brand new substance because a brand new molecule was created. Right? Water is just huge solid quantities of these water molecules. When you have molecules together, you have a substance called a compound. And we're going to use the word compound like the word element to refer to the substance made up of molecules. Elements are substances made up of just atoms. Compounds are substances made up of molecules. Okay, molecules form substances called compounds. Okay, you don't have to write every one of these down, you know this. Now you have a picture on your handout, don't you, that looks like this? Can you now put these 4 words in the right boxes? Right? Things that are individual or things that are in groups, right? The physical entity, the actual object itself, the word for that would go here, and the name for the substance would go here. Can you put these 4 words in the appropriate boxes now? What would be the physical object that would be one by one, that would be single? What would be the physical object that would be groups of something? What would the substance name of that be? What would the substance name of this be? Giving you a few moments to fill that in. And please make sure you write it down. Even if you're not sure, put your best guess on your paper. Don't wait for me to show you the answers. If there's something here that you mixed up or didn't get right, that would be a chance for you to learn. If you just wait for me to do it for you, you might not learn anything here. Put your life on the line. Okay? All right, everybody think they have it? Okay, let's see. Where does everything go here? Well, that's atoms, right? Elements, molecules, and compounds, right? Atoms are the single little individual entities making up a substance called elements, right? Molecules are groups of atoms making up substances that we call compounds. Let me give you one other example of this. The point that I'm trying to make here is you have some things that have a certain character to them, like oxygen or hydrogen. But when you combine them, you get brand new capabilities, brand new properties, don't you? Something new comes into existence by just putting together simpler things. Here's another example of that. Table salt. I'm talking about the salt that you and I use in our food. Right? Anybody know the chemical name of this? Not the formula, but just what do we call it? Sodium chloride, right? The name that we use is sodium chloride. Now what that tells me is that the salt that I put on my eggs or my French fries, that stuff is made up of two elements, sodium and chlorine. Now when you stop and think about it for a minute, this is kind of a radical thing. Right? Do you know what chlorine is? What is it? It's not good. It's a poisonous gas. It's very corrosive, very destructive, which is why we use it to clean things. It's why we use it to destroy microbes that might be growing in the swimming pool. Or we use it to destroy stains that might have gathered on our clothing. Or we scour the bathtub with it. It's corrosive, destructive. It's a gas, which most of us think it's a liquid, right? It's not a liquid, it's a gas. You buy it like in a chlorine bottle, but what they did is they took some water and they put chlorine pressure, gas under pressure, and forced it into the water. If you leave the lid off the chlorine bottle for very long, you'll just have water. All the gas will evaporate out of the water and you'll just have a bottle of water. Huh? Oh, you can use it as a weapon. Yeah, you can use it as, because it's so deadly, it could be used that way. But chlorine is a very destructive thing as an element. Sodium isn't too much better, right? Anybody know what sodium is in its elemental form? It's what? It's a metal, right? It's a metal. It kind of looks like this. It's very soft, kind of a light gray color. You have to store it in oil because it's so reactive. If you put it in water, it begins to flame and will even generate so much heat that it'll explode. I used to do that when I taught high school biology classes. You want to entertain a little bit. And I'd have a vat of water on my desk. And before class, I'd go back in the back, and we had some sodium just like this in a jar, in a tube like that. You could pull it out, cut off a little crumb, and it had to be just a tiny little crumb of this stuff. You can cut this with a butter knife. I mean, it's not like steel or iron or something like that. It's very, very soft, but you could cut a little crumb, and I'd talk about, we'd have more time to talk about chemical things and stuff, but just drop that in the water, and it wouldn't even sink. It's a metal, but it wouldn't even sink because it would start reacting on the surface, looking a lot like this. It'd start flaming, and it would race around, go, and then it'd go pop. If it was small enough, it was just right. Then it would pop and blow water all over the table, and students are all going, "Do it again, do it again." But it's very highly reactive to the point of being explosive. So the question then is, how comfortable do you feel putting an explosive metal and a poisonous gas on your French fries? That feel okay? See, it's not. That's what chlorine is. That's what sodium is. But when you put them in a chemical combination, they become something else. They become something more. They become an essential element in your diet. You must have salt. If you've studied any history, you know that there are cultures that use salt as money because it's so important. There are places in the world where it's not easy to get salt. If you live near an ocean, it's not hard to get salt because the oceans are all salt water. But if you live hundreds of miles from an ocean, salt becomes a very valuable substance. You must have it. Every animal, farmers know they have to put salt licks out for their cattle and sheep because they've got to, every once in a while they know they need salt and they go get some. So the atoms in table salt arrange themselves like this. These are sodium and chlorine atoms that you see here. This you want to put on your French fries. This you do not want to put on your French fries. Okay? So we're building the human body from atoms up, right? Now, as these atoms come together, as they're bonded together, there are really two patterns of bonding, two ways, two basic patterns to all of existence. Okay? One is called the organic pattern, and the other is called the inorganic pattern. The organic pattern, there's sort of a pattern to how atoms come together and join with one another to build living things. There's another pattern where things come together to build inorganic things. If you take any chemistry class beyond general chemistry, you're usually either taking an organic chemistry class or something like that, or what they call physical chemistry class. Physical chemistry is this inorganic types of bonding. So organic is living things. It's the pattern that we use for living things. And inorganic then is stuff like rocks or metals, the air, right, the sand, these kinds of things that we recognize that are not alive have a bonding pattern that looks like what we were showing before. There's a pattern that would be organic. There's an organic molecule. And here's an inorganic type of bonding. You can see this is more structured, geometric, crystalline, in a sense. If you've ever seen salt crystals under a microscope, they have a very geometric pattern, whereas organic molecules have all sorts of interesting shapes. If you've taken chemistry, you know that this is a covalent type bonding, whereas this is an ionic type bonding. That's getting a little beyond the scope of this class. But you know, if everything I've done right here is brand new to you, this is where you have a struggle doing anything in physiology, because physiology is going to take you deep into these kinds of bonding patterns. So you really do need to have a chemistry class. I've given you kind of a very, very simple layout here. Let's look just a little bit more at the organic, because of course these are the molecules that make up our human bodies. There are really 4 distinct types of molecules that you should be just generally familiar with. And again, we won't go deep into this in this class, but you should have just this basic layout. Carbohydrates are a class of organic molecules that have a certain shape, a certain arrangement of atoms in them. You and I would know these as things like sugars and starches. The human body uses these mostly for energy, although there are a few tissues in your human body or a few cellular structures that do incorporate carbohydrates as part of their structure, but very, very few. Mostly energy molecules for us. This is, your brain runs exclusively on sugar. A second type would be proteins. We think of in meats and things like that. Actually, the physical structure of all living things, the foundational structure is protein. Bodies are constructed basically from protein. In fact, it's the proteins that make every living thing different from one another. You know, if you compare yourself to a tree or a fish or a lizard, the primary differences in the structures of your body will be in their proteins. The genetic code in your human body tells your cells which proteins to build. It doesn't tell it which carbohydrates to build or any other molecule. Your genetic code tells your cells which proteins to build. A third type are lipids, which are fats and oils. That's the type of thing we think of in our diet. There are many, many structural components in your body that are constructed out of lipids. We also, though, use lipids for energy. You can store twice as much energy in a lipid as you can in a carbohydrate, which is why when we store energy in our body prefers to store it as fat. You know, think of 2 batteries, one that's twice, they're the same size, but one holds twice as much electricity as the other one. The fat will hold twice as much energy as the carbohydrate molecule. So, fats and oils. And then the fourth category are the nucleic acids, the information molecules in our human body. This is the genetic code. This is what tells the elements of your human body, the cells of your human body, what to build. So this lecture has essentially been the foundational structure. We're trying to set this sort of chemical foundation to all living things, so that you have a basis upon which to understand everything else we're going to talk about. If we're building this from the bottom up, what are the things that are at the foundation of everything else? Okay? They are, okay, the atoms, right? The elemental atoms, these 92 different kinds of atoms, are the foundational building blocks of everything. If you cremate a human body, you take it right back down to here. Right? And atoms then are put together into molecules, right? Organic molecules. And some of them are even giant molecules, macromolecules, right? We've got sort of a foundational level, intermediate level. The things that make up the structure of your human body is right here. Atoms organized into molecules, some of those being giant molecules, all of these molecules being organic type molecules. Any questions about this thus far?